for the deliberation later on. Yeah. As usual, state your preferred gender pronouns if you have any, your preferred POI preferences. Let's just default it to if you do not say it, then take it by voice. So just do mention it if you want it to be within chat, for example. Speech are meant for 7 minutes, 15 seconds extra just for grace period, just to wrap things up. And anything beyond 7:15, of course, won't be recorded down simply because you want to be fair to all the debaters here. Everyone gets equal time and equal consideration. All right, let's begin the round. Calling upon the House to order. Debating on motion stated for round five, I would like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister to here. Oh yeah, please do drop your speaking orders in the chat. Yeah, thank you very much.
By the way, my partner is telling me that in the DMs that her phone is giving her challenges. I don't know if she's having any progress so far.
Oh, I see. Can you please check on her, please? Otherwise we will just wait for like I think 2 or 3 minutes to see. Otherwise, we just need to eye in person.
Sorry, hi. I'm his partner. My network is still really shaky, but I can just give my speech.
Alrighty. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. I'm ready when you.
Okay. If at any point network does go down, I'm very sorry. Please just try to stop me. Okay, so my name is Noma. Please just There's no chat space. Please just, you're able to like vocalize your PI. I'm here and I will respond. Of that, I'll begin my speech at the next word. Panel, first things first, understand why central banks exist and what they're supposed to do. Three things. Number one, they're supposed to be there to ensure monetary stability. Number two, the financial system, that there's a financial system that people can be reliant on. Number three, it's supposed to be there to ensure that there's a long-term economic stability of the country. Very important. Why? We say that central banks are the backbones of every single economy. The rise and fall of a country is determined or largely but dependent upon the success of a central bank. So this debate, quite frankly, boils down to thing. How should central banks manage national wealth in a globalized economy, which is very important. Why? Because we tell you in concepts quo, the globalized economy has become the new thing. What does this mean, panel? It means that every single global economy is interconnected. Global stability is no longer isolated. The rise and fall country's economy is no longer just dependent on the single country, on a singular country. The rise and fall of a country can be affected by the global economy. Essentially what we're saying. What does this mean for the central banks, panel? We think what we've seen in status is that short-term certainty can no longer be used to justify the expense of future security. What does this look like, panel? We think at the point in time the global interest rates have gone down. We've seen an erosion in terms of the value of our bonds. In terms of our value of our bonds. And global banks are literally getting little to negative returns on an annual basis. Why is this very problematic, panel? Because we tell you inflation then erodes bond value and the central bank then fails its mandate. We think at the point in time there is no the things we already have in the central bank are not even getting us more money. We're not getting any more returns. We think this then means at the point in time a crisis occurs, we will collapse as a country. Why is it very important to understand why the value of bonds and our gold and whatever the central bank has ought to increase? One, we tell you that currently in status quo, we have a lot of global crises. This can look like the pandemic, the wars panel, and the global economy crashing. This is very important because that then means the muscle the central banks need to have has been amplified. These central banks need to ensure that number one, not only is the economy stable, but number two, they're able to actively alleviate the symptoms of a crisis. But number three, we tell you then the global economy is very diverse. We think that the big way to respond to ensure that number one, central banks are strong enough to ensure that we have diversification. So just one thing to really take care of. Significant expansion just means meaningful diversification. Doesn't mean that we're abandoning the bonds and gold panel. We think we're still conservative to make people comfortable. Panel, we think we still engage with we still engage with the global economy. We think number one, we're making sure that we are able to survive long term. But number two, we make sure that what we have in our reserves increase our value. Now, why is this very important? Because we tell you that they're going to engage with this panel as long-term investors. Central banks are not traders who are going to be, whoopsie doozy because of the volatility of the space. I think they're going to be long-term investors. This then ensures that the volatility only hurts the traders, not the investors like the central banks, right? Which then means we avoid any kind of I'll take you in the next 2 minutes. This then means that they avoid manipulation. But not only that, what do we then mean, panel? We tell that we're going to have a firewall between the monetary policy and the investment decisions, meaning we will not have any form of, oh my gosh, but corruption, politicians panel. We think we want absolute transparency, but not only that, we want to ensure that the people that within these countries are actively able to be, their is protected. But on to the justification. The justification, right? Why we think this is really important. Number one, we think the central bank's reserve strategies are inefficient. The low interest rate in terms of bonds, the low interest rate we've been seeing in terms of bonds is very problematic. In today's world, low yields are extremely problematic because then that means when problems and crises keep increasing, it then means what is in your reserves is not enough to handle status quo. Not able to handle status quo. These yields then means that the point in time inflation occurs, and we've been having inflation quite rampantly, panel, then erodes the values of the gold. And this is status quo panel. We think at the point in time the reserve strategy have been failing or quite frankly are inefficient. We've been seeing a devaluing of the bond. The gold becomes very problematic. I think we ought to engage. But number two, we think that central banks need long-term growth, not just liquidity. We need to protect the national wealth beyond crisis. Okay, go.
Do you think that central banks can still participate? Do you think that individual countries can still participate in the global economy even when they don't expand their foreign reserves into foreign equity?
Well, this debate is a comparison debate, right? Number one, but then how should we do this and countries do this? We think we can still engage, but not only that, we think it's like really weird POI panel because we tell you, number one, every single country that exists in these economy is already part of the global economy. There's no such thing as domestic stability, because nation panel, we think that doesn't exist. Isolation is a facade, it no longer exists. Your countries are already interconnected in terms of economies. Weird POI. But also, let's go back panel. We think central banks need long-term growth, not just liquidity, because we ought to protect the nation. What does this mean, panel? We think that until number one, we need a central bank that protects the welfare, and number two is able to survive beyond any single crisis. We want a reserve bank that we don't vouch for a reserve bank that never grows. Now on to impact on what do you think the future looks like. Number one, we think that we get higher stable returns. Equities, we think equities outperform bonds in long term. And why is this very important? Because I think the long-term sustainability of a country is extremely important. Long-term certainty does not work. And we think with current status quo, what we've been telling you that like the central banks constantly engaging with like inflation and the crises, we tell you already the bonds and the gold are devaluing. This is very important because we tell you we can't even guarantee that you have like your reserves are going to be strong enough to engage. But number two, we need to make sure that long term there are stronger reserves. We want number one, stronger reserves country, but number two, strong crisis reserves. But also like on impact layer, tier number two, we think we want less resilience on like less reliance on volatile currencies. Meaning, at the point in time any currency fails, we want to ensure that our central banks are able to sustain the economy of the country, regardless of the volatility of currencies. But number three, economic resilience is only probable when we make decisions that actively ensure that number one, we're able to deal with any crisis that emerge, but number two, that we're stable. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's time already.
Okay, sorry.
All right, thank you very much to the Prime Minister for the fine speech. Now inviting leader of the opposition. Here. Wait, hold on, let me read the chat. Prince, would you try and drop out of the call and rejoining it back quickly so that you won't miss the LO speech?
Oh,
Can you try that first?
okay. For O speaking
Okay,
order.
so I managed to get to solve the problem. I don't know if I'm audible, but I'm just using headphones before I speak, and then I can remove them if they're affecting my microphone.
Oh yeah, we can hear you fine right now. Okay, so I guess the issue is solved, so we can now invite the leader of the opposition. Here.
Okay, thanks for that. I already posted the speaker positions for both. I mean for House OO. Pronouns anything, POI anytime. The earlier the better. I might not be able to take you when you launch your POI way later because I still have to properly time the speed at which I read my speech. Hopefully I am audible, and I'm gonna assume that I am because there weren't any problems about my audio earlier. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Go. Just like any common bank jailbreaks, to prison and to resist fire and brimstone from accessing that vault is the safest option to guarantee the return and immediacy of money. The first thing I'm gonna do is directly engage against Prime Minister. The main idea being pushed is to say that everything is interconnected, but there's zero discussion as to what actor initiates or forms that bridge to interconnect, especially in the economic landscape. The entire case is very reliant on a can case that is not nuanced at all. In the current status quo, GIC GICs, and other public institutions coalesce more on investments, literally far better than those forms of banks, and have retrospectively been successful, e.g. the one in Singapore or like Singapore's GIC or what have you. The main reason why a certain amount of bonds are always kept, especially that it's being conserved, is because the bank itself still controls the extent of this monetary influence. This means that when you keep a huge amount, you can still dictate and easily shift whether or not a certain country has to opt towards far more contractionary policies, e.g. in combating hyperinflation, or expansionary monetary policies. You lose that freedom when the majority is now focused only towards the expansive end of these banks, so you essentially are not able to properly check and balance the amount of economic run flow you have. What government did not prove, however, is why most economic failures are because of too constrictive banks. I'm going to be generous and engage on both ends on my constructives. Before proceeding to extensions, I want to reframe some crucial things in this debate to make it far more comparative. One, the counterfactual in opposition is not simply zero investment or less investment. It's a matter of which actor is able to invest. By the principle of the central bank, what is only required to be kept is literally just 10%. This means that on both ends, the monetary circulation is equal. The difference is on the expression of that form of value, whether or not it's the form of availability and that value being more accessible to people or to certain businesses. In a literal sense, that any economic major should know, liquidized value is the most accessible form of value because reallocation is targeted and nuanced in nature. This means that the value that this money takes place is more onto direct transactions, contrary to OG's counterfactual. Even if it's not liquidated, e.g. in any other forms aside from bonds, it's a way at which this money is not directly allocable and restricted towards only one form of business or one form of international industry. But secondly, I think it's important to identify the vulnerability of those forms of money and the extent of dependency of these central banks on either houses. On-site governments, central banks are forced to continuously collaborate its value in businesses or any other foreign values that exist. This means that the local value, both the shock and benefit, is sourced to greater amount of people. But that interconnectedness is what precisely poisons the point of monetary security. Because guys, the purpose of central banks is not in rooting out different values and having multiple sources. In the current status quo, which is also OO's counterfactual, it's a way at which you limit it to different agencies like GICs in Singapore and any other governmental investment corporations. This is crucial because even if side government discusses how GICs still exist on their end, the comparative is on the extent at which they are able to serve its purpose and in properly identifying the key difference between GICs and central banks themselves. But three, the term significantly is necessary because Gov has to still discuss the transitionary period when they ought to expand and the changes of these forms of monetary reserves. Notice this House believes that X should Y. This means it's still a policy motion. They can't simply say that this looks like a simple transition to newer companies. They have to discuss why that shift of availability in terms of bonds, which is available towards a larger population or businesses, can still serve the same amount of people as when it's already pre-allocated internationally. All of this framing leads me to my two simple contributions. One, how you preserve the purpose of central banks and to clearly determine the purpose of banks and other investment strategies. This is the most proximate case insofar as this questions whether or not these investments should be done in the first place, regardless if government proves that you boost investment options or economic flow. Essentially, this is prerequisite to running all cases in this debate, and that CO has to be reliant to disprove. Three reasons why true. One, reserve banks are able to focus on local investments on our end, and they have less burden to intersectionalize internationally. Notice that even central banks itself still has to intersectionalize locally. I do not understand as to why it's insufficient in nature. If it does, as OG probably implicitly assert, it's to say that you have to boost locally and not to be dependent internationally. But two, because investment strategies are far more delineated on our end, these banks and the investment can still be directed or put to these central banks. The difference is on the ownership of these liquidized assets. We suggest that even the state itself can still own this, even if it's not the bank. Reserve management corporations or any other investment arm still exists, and this chapter on the gray zones of investments and international reserves still exists on both ends. But three, because these central banks still has the agency to dictate the direction at which one is able to respond towards economic shocks, whether or not they have to be constrictive in nature or whether or not they have to be expansive. Three reasons to why this is extremely proximate. One, on incentives, banks prioritize their stabilizing capacity over the expansionary end. But two, the premise of these banks, especially on stability, has to bank upon stable systems as well. That's why local intersectionality already exists highly. Smaller banks literally are easily affected at all. Why is this important? One, this engages against OG's positive material, that even if you are able to expand to a greater extent as they assert is the way at which the extent at which those forms of expansions are not guaranteed to target the very root cause as to why there are economic problems. The second discussion is on the economic impact. I'll prove why the increase of the economy is still proportional to what the country needs. This is extremely important and also generous against OG because one, this bites one the bullet that even if OG has higher progression, it's still able to meet the necessities of these international countries. But two, that the extent of benefit you get in OG is negligible and not a tipping point for this debate. Three reasons why true. One, reserve requirements are already inherently adaptive towards the economic stimulus. In fact, the main reason why oftentimes the reserve requirement is just 10% and that the change of percentage is only by a percent or two is precisely why changes within these central banks are tantamount and can cause instability. This is why the nuance on significance is necessary because transitions on central banks not only affect the central banks but also other public financial institutions also take a shock towards these changes. This means that even the availability towards the central bank forces a shift towards the smaller banks as well. This is the extent of influence and impact that OG completely misses. One, smaller banks are forced to become more conservative in nature in order to balance the current shift of these central banks. By means of trickle-down economics, it means that local banks are less likely able to stimulate the local country. This means that you have to be fully dependent internationally. I think you lose your own agency. Why is this important? One, this engages against OG's positive material that the amount of money on government is far more guaranteed. Even if there is a current decrease in value of those forms, e.g. of gold and what have you that PM mentioned, they never prove why those other values are irrecuperable by other forms and any other investments. How is this able to close the entire debate as early as LO? One, this properly positions that OG's entire case is less relevant, especially when they only discuss about expanding economies, which isn't the sole purpose of these banks itself. But two, even with government's best case, we're able to prove that at least we are able to get money that stimulates the local country itself, I mean the country itself nationally, instead of being dependent internationally, which is far more unstable. All those reason, opening opposition. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the leader opposition for the fine speech. Now inviting Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Okay, confirm I'm audible.
Yep, loud and clear, ready when you are.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. I think it's important from engagement to be clinical about about why they very much lose this debate. They're very uncharitable in terms of how they engage our case to that extent, because they assume the very idea that these central banks move, I think, a large chunk of their assets towards these foreign reserves and into these foreign equities in of itself. I think the motion is very clear. You only move foreign reserves. You don't move, I think, all of your economic assets to that regard. But I think, too, Noma already established to you that it's like an important, I think, economic principle in of itself in this debate, right? She talks about how large actors that hold large amounts of capital ought to diversify their assets in terms of where they invest them, so that they potentially, I think, reduce the risk of those assets being devalued during things like crises in of itself, because these large capitals have a direct impact to a large scale of people to that extent. They don't engage with that particular principle, because I think in terms of the idea of what our case stands for, it doesn't stand for completely removing most of these economic assets from a local basis to foreign equities in of itself wholly. I think you're moving the foreign reserves in of themselves and you're diversifying them to that extent. They don't engage with the core benefit of that particular principle in of itself in nature. I think straight into what then the debate ought to be about to that extent. I think a couple of things here. Noma tells you that the problem that currently exists is that the mechanisms that currently are being used within most states are likely yielding enough in terms of returns in of themselves. I think she tells you a great deal about how bonds in of themselves don't work, how most of the assets that back, I think, economies like gold in of themselves are becoming less volatile and it becomes particularly constraining. But she also talks about interdependency that already exists globally between most nations, but most of these nations are unable to, externally utilize that to their advantage to grow most of yield. This is partly important because I'm going to add on into that framing of that particular problem. Because the problem isn't just about that. I think it's about the constrained monetary policies that states and of themselves have, the policies and the crises that are currently frequent. So the main problem is that one, states in of themselves don't have solid shock absorption, I think, mechanisms that are likely to withstand during like many crises. But the problem is that one, if you realize within modern societies, crises have become a frequent feature of modern states. Like you have pandemics, you have wars. I think you have a lot of climate issues that likely happen most frequently in most instances. This is very important because it therefore means you ought to then create a world. I think at the end of the day, you need to be able to show how then the states can have better risk absorptions, especially through central banks. Because the core role of what central banks do to that extent is one, they don't just crucially hold the economy together, but I think they work most importantly during things like crises, for things like bailouts to states in of themselves, but also to keep the economy in of itself intact and very much together, right? It's direct impact to just like states and the people within those economies, but also to stabilize the global markets in of themselves. I think to that extent, if you don't get any form of mechanism from their side as to how best the alternatives that are currently in status quo are working, I think to that extent they don't like deserve to win this debate just simply by like attacking our model in of itself. Yeah, I'll take it.
Your alternative is very silly. If you concede that currently status quo is largely volatile, I'm unclear as to why you need to expand it to foreign actors that are non-proximate and more volatile in your world. You need to justify why this is a justifiable thing to do anyways.
No, first of all, if you're really an investor, you'd realize that volatility isn't a problem. We don't stand to say that volatility is what is happening right now. It's parallelly bad. That's absurd. I think the more volatile you get, I think you get foreign markets to be, the more yield that you're likely to get from particularly that. But I think to that extent, I think even if the case was about volatility, I think the nature of the problems that we craft that are currently there, you can't just say it's symmetrical. They're likely to be worse in instances where you have those constrained monetary policies to your state, but you're likely not to get better yields from the alternatives that you have on your side of the world. Now, let's just go straight on to mechanization of paralleling these ideas, right? I think one, shocks are now consistent, like I've already said. But two, monetary policies that currently exist that central banks have been trying to use likely don't are exhausted, right? One, interest rates usually hit zero, but two, qualitative easing in most instances causes inflation. But I think three, I think printing money has shown that it usually destroys purchasing power in most instances because of the high risk of how you don't have any certainty within how people of themselves are likely to relate to that printed money. I think in most instances, in crises, you would have already lost confidence from people into I think particularly spending more within the economy. But I think thirdly, fiscal tools that even states themselves try are likely not working. So to that extent, I think when shocks hit states, you're likely faced with either one, you get inflated, you get austerity, you either get inflated as an economy, you try austerity measures that are likely failing, but you then likely, at the end of the day, because of all those failures, result in social breakdown within those particular states. While then bonds in of themselves also partially feel this particular risk, right? I think one in terms of liquidity, stability, but also predictability. Because in most instances, bonds yield very low returns in of themselves, that are 0 to 2% in most instances. But two, inflation erodes the real value of these particular bonds because it's already crises. But thirdly, reserves stagnate or shrink in of themselves. So when crisis hits, states in of themselves still lack the fiscal space, the political space, and the economic space to stop that particular risk. Why then do particularly this model in of itself then succeed to solve this particular problem, right? I think one, it's about the rate at which it manages to generate real growth in of itself. Because the amount of growth that you get from reserves being in foreign equities is likely to grow faster than the inflation that you're likely to be facing within that particular crisis, which is probably very important because if you're going to impact or combat inflation, you need your economic growth to outpace it. But two, I think in terms of reserves, reserves becoming capital and not cash, right? The state needs now owns, I think, productive assets that are not just IOUs that in of themselves are in the local market and are likely to be dependent on the economic, I think, performance that you already are lacking within that particular state. But I think over time, this also builds a shock absorption buffer, which is very important because when crisis hits, the state then draws on accumulated gains that you get already from foreign markets. But I think more importantly, in terms of analysis, notice how foreign markets in of themselves are likely to be very huge. It means at a point in time when you're then tapping into that global exchange, like foreign markets, you likely already have insulation in terms of manipulation, because these are big equities. It's not very easy for them to be easily manipulated. But because you are a central bank, you have large amounts of equity and liquidity that are likely to, I think, fall like easily to like losses in of themselves. But two, you already have a very visible and clear trajectory of where these markets are going. They don't just surprise you and fall at any particular time. I think the investment in of itself is likely to be safe and sound to that extent.
Time.
I think in terms of principles, we're already beating OO because we proved to you why that diversification of itself is parallelly very important and trickles down to these benefits to the economy and how it affects the people within that particular state.
All right, thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister, for the fine speech. Reminder, your speech is meant for 7 minutes, 15 seconds extra just to wrap things up. Anything beyond 7:15 won't be in my notes and my panelists as well, because 7:15 is just the general allocation of time for everybody to, give their speeches. So yeah, moving on to have the speech from Diao. Thank you.
Hi, assuming I'm audible. Name's Chap, like between people just call me Chap. Your voice. No, actually, I don't think I'll be able to make it in POI. It's Sorry, just need to organize stuff. Just give me like 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, starting like speech. I don't think that opening up position has the higher burden to prove that current status quo is something that's going to be much more better. But in fact, the only thing that we need to do is like the transition currently that proposition is standing on is something that is unnecessary in the very first place, and it further risks or it further places large amounts of risk for these sort of central banks to proliferate in terms of like sustainability, in terms of like financial stability in the very first place. I want to be very clear on what the contribution leader of opposition was able to sufficiently prove that even Deputy Prime Minister did not engage on. The premise he explained is that the primary function of central banks is to be able to provide highly liquid or immediately usable money or asset because it's much more predictable compared to the foreign equity, but it's much more volatile and subject to market crashes. For example, on the flip of crashes, for example, on operating on the same premise that open government opens. On the flip side, foreign reserves are much more reliable in times of crisis because they are much more like liquid. They are much more liquid and are much more reliable. For example, in what other states have been used to using. For example, this just overall means that despite the diversity case that you get from opening government, you still risk the downfall of these central banks because of how precisely there's risks of economic or political volatility existing. For example, this directly engages to the zero sum extension that you get from the DPM because yes, you will have an increasingly diverse set of market, but it's only going to be hegemonized by the developed countries that have far better stability or safety net when the market fails. For example, because they have better local bank reserves and are far better currency, for example, for safety net that can easily catch them, for example, when it comes to the crisis. This is not engaging on their worst case, but in fact, this is the world that they paint in which current status quo is facing, where there's global economic instability in the very first place, which means that COSPR to DPM was right. You actively deter states to opt in to these central banks in the very first place because it's far too risky because of the economic volatility that's existing because of that. For example, how you have more likely than not higher force existing within status quo when you try to engage within these sort of Federal Reserves, for example, in the very first place. I also just want to point out how funny it is when he argues that you don't give all your bank reserves to the foreign equity company because, bro, let's be for real. In order for you to reap the extent of benefits that you want to push on your side of the bench, you have to commit to the far extent of your cases. The first extension I want to prove on that engages with the vast majority of cases from opening government is just how there's literally higher probability than not of global market being volatile in nature, even absent the current status quo, and more likely in the future it's going to happen again, in which these foreign equities rely on broadly. The first premise is just if you look at the patterns that have happened with respectively in current status quo, you see a lot of like political tensions across multiple states, especially within the superpowers who compete for power, for example, US, Russia, China, and what have you. More likely than not, this simply means that that changes or spikes in the foreign equity is something that's more prominent because with the diversification of the stock exchange or market, and you putting your reserve there, for example, you're more likely inviting a lot of currency disparities, which makes it so hard to access in the very first place, especially with the global power states having a highly competitive sort of currency in the very get-go. This means that as there are exchanges and tariffs and elevation of the barrier of trade between these countries by virtue of political tension, it's more likely not going to make the stock market more volatile and harder to access for a vast majority of states in the very first place. For example, this does not ensure that these central banks get to compete or get to compete within these sort of companies, but more likely than not, they're going to they're going to lose more amount of like reserve value for the same exact reasons that they even paint on opening government, that they cannot simply just opt into this sort of like transition, which was correctly questioned by leader of opposition that DPM did not try to cater to. Why is this inherently harmful? If you track back to the speech of my leader of opposition, what he was able to sufficiently prove is that the core purpose of or functions of these central banks, that they are meant to be highly liquid or easily accessible in the very first place because they are concrete and highly dependable in the very get-go. The impacts therefore are simple, that when there is a spike in the market volatility, more likely than not, you have impacts that are far more great and are irreversible at an immense amount of time. For example, AG on inflation and reserve depletion, because now states need to keep borrowing and borrowing, even like from the central bank. And this is us engaging on our worst days, where even if government argues that currency bonds are lower in value within current status quo, we think that's simply going to be further exacerbated under government bench when you open to unpredictable market stock exchanges, especially when they are largely hegemonized by developed countries. When you don't get diversity on their side, you actively risk employment rate and less actively risk unemployment rate and less capability of these opting states to develop and open more opportunities for people in the very first place. The second
Point.
thing I want to talk about later. Stop badgering. The later thing I want to talk about is just how there's a far larger risk of like political involvement within these central banks and why it's highly problematic because in the very first place, these central banks ought not to be politically involved in the very first place. The first premise on this argumentation or extension is just broadly in the underdeveloped states or the unstable ones that opt in the very first place. I want to first preface this by clarifying that since this is still a THBT motion, we still ought to consider utilitarian and principal cases in this debate. Now, we think that because they're inherently less capacitated to talk about these developing nations, they're the ones who are mostly dependent on these central banks where they can borrow capital and all that reserved for their development. We think that the case of low interest rate the government talks about is something that actually shields or helps these developing nations in the very first place. Yes, you understand that you need central banks to survive in the long run, but biting on these premises that Prime Minister talks about the majority of instances, the global market is interconnected. You're more likely to exclude these developing nations on a comparative. You're more likely than not going to make central banks way more viable. You're less likely going to make it less viable towards the developing nations. What does this mean? I want to be very clear that majority of instances, states that opt into these banks are developing nations because obviously why would US go and opt into this with unless there's like a huge economic crisis. I think the flip side on our comparative is just much more better because you give these larger companies higher interest rates, which is the self-correcting mechanism that government is worried about. Because either way, what leader of opposition was able to prove that you get to it was able to prove was that the central banks are not the actors of our financial institutions, because where he explained to you the counterfactual way, there are more like government-based sort of companies that are opting into these sort of trade foreign trade, for example, in order to boom the economy, for example. But then secondly, we think that by logic, there are far more number of developing nations compared to secure and developed nations, which means that currently in status quo, you see central banks implementing reserve quotas or like lending quotas and slowly lowering the timeline in which developing nations should be able to pay their loans. For example, this fixes how you get to like better reserves, for example, or at least like better currency at the very end of the day. Lastly, the implication is simple. On the comparative and government bench, when you push for this sort of transition, you risk higher chances of reserves having less value because precisely of the reasons the LO explains that it excludes the optionality of these states or developing states in the very first place because of how it's something that's too risky. For example, our side, then why is our side far better? Our side is far better financially because it preserves like specific institutional role of central banks rather than trying to optimize returns at the cost of like reliability. With all those reasons, COO.
Thank you very much. Deputy Leader of Opposition for the fine speech. This close the opening half of the debate. Now going to the closing half, inviting member of GAP here.
Just give me a second. I'm setting up my timer.
Yep, no worries. Give me a countdown when you begin, yeah?
Cool, cool. I love to take POIs from O exclusively via chat. Please don't verbalize. Just a second. I'll start my speech on the reverse count of three, two, and one. OG's case is about how, if you invest in foreign equities, you are able to hedge yourself against the risk of you going ahead and when you fall in crisis, not going ahead and falling into balance of payment crisis or things like that. It is contingent upon them proving that why the assets you are divesting from are not enough for you to go ahead and prevent you against the crisis, which O rightly points out. At CG, we are going to vertically extend upon how the main reserve that these central banks hold right now is not government bonds, but the foreign currency of US dollar and euro, which currently are massively uncertain and falling, and how you investing in public foreign equities within multiple stock markets, within multiple companies and multiple sectors, just hedge you far more against the fall of USD or any uncertainties in USD. The first burden to this argument is why USD is the major reserve asset for developing nation central bank as opposed to bonds. The first reason for that is majority of these reserves were held because USA had hegemonic power and established Bretton Woods institutions like IMF and World Bank, who lent these countries developmental aid loans and emergency loans in USD or euro. The second is that these were historically far more stable currencies, even though they are right now certain. Historically, during the time of hegemony and after the end of Cold War, they did show huge amounts of stability. But thirdly, because multiple countries were colonized by Europe, they have their currencies being hedged against euro and things like that. For example, within Sahel region, how France has significant influence till now and has their currency hedged to euro. This means that these central banks significantly hold their reserves within USD or euro. The second thing I want to prove is why is it getting uncertain? And recently, dollar had shown a massive hit because of how uncertain the markets have become in regards to foreign exchange. There are three reasons for that. First, when Russia's assets were blocked, countries became really wary of how much they can trust US dollar or how much they can trust euro. The second is that the rise of alternative power structures like China and India just create far more uncertainty because you can do trade in rupee or you can do trade in yen or yuan and things like that. But thirdly, Trump's recent interventionism in Venezuela or recent tariffs and things like that means that you feel that dollars are becoming really uncertain or euro is becoming really uncertain. How do we then, if we go ahead and invest in stock markets of Europe, if we go ahead and invest in stock markets of America, how are we able to go ahead and hedge ourselves against the fall of USD or against the fall of euro? There are two reasons for that. The premise of this claim is that when currencies fall, stock market rises. This is simple. The way you have to hedge yourself against risk is when one asset which you predominantly hold is falling, the other asset which you want to hedge itself against rises. I.e., if currency reserves are falling, the stock market should rise proportionately to the fall of currency reserve so that you are able to maintain stability in your central bank reserves. Why do stock markets rise when forex markets fall? There are two reasons for that. When dollar becomes weaker, American companies are able to export more because their currency becomes relatively weaker as opposed to other currencies in which they are exporting. This means that the American goods become far more competitive, American services become far more competitive, and companies tend to grow far more. The second reason is that note when these foreign currencies fall, like US dollar or euro, Indian rupee or Chinese yuan and things like that just become stronger, which means it becomes easier for Indian people, it becomes easier for Chinese people or Japanese people or Africans to
POI.
significantly invest in, I said via chat, to invest in US markets or EU markets, which means that these companies have a short-term boost because there's a new wave of retail investors and institutional investors like pension fund from India and things like that that invest within these kinds of stock markets. This means that there's a rise in these stock markets. Why are these uncertainties which we are facing right now are not true for the uncertainties in dollar is not true for stock markets. There are two reasons for that. First, Trump hasn't hit stock markets that much. In fact, US stock markets, because of the presence of Magnificent Seven like OpenAI and Nvidia, have shown a significant rise historically. But secondly, these private players have significantly larger lobbies which go ahead and maintain stability like Wall Street lobby or things like that. But thirdly, note when central banks are the ones who are investing within uh, these kinds of institutions like public equities of foreign countries, these central banks collectively can lobby for larger regulation, larger stability, and things like that. So even if it is volatile, O had to prove that why after central banks have invested in these kinds of things, then also they would stay volatile. I'll take up UI. Go ahead. Three, two, one. No POI.
Yeah, so at
The,
this, here's the thing.
Uh,
Okay.
go
Yeah,
ahead,
so
anyone.
at this point of the debate, your case is symmetric because, like, your case is non-contentious because we agree that the US is suffering. You need to link that then to why this
What the
expansion is
fuck?
going to
Like
be in
it's
a manner
not
that is
symmetric.
beneficial.
No. Just shut. It's not symmetric because we are investing in foreign equities significantly and divesting from USD and governmental bonds and things like that. Like it's not symmetric. The second thing I want to say is when crisis hits, note, when crisis hits, that's fine. We are able to go ahead and diversify into public equities. But OG is and OO is missing the burden when crisis is not hitting and markets are booming. Then the reserve that central banks hold, gold, significantly reduces in value because people go ahead and divest from gold because they feel that markets are optimistic and we need to invest in stock markets. In those particular times, these central banks can make huge amounts of profit if they invest in these public equities when gold is falling and public equities are rising. But the second thing, note if during optimistic times, central banks have held gold. The investors are removing their funds from gold and investing in foreign public equities. You make a significant amount of loss on your gold because you are still
Time.
holding that. Super proud.
All right. Thank you very much, Member Olga, for the fine speech. Now inviting Member of Asia.
I just want to confirm I'm clearly audible if I speak like this.
Yep, loud and clear, ready when you are. Give me a countdown
Yeah,
before you start, yeah.
yeah, it's okay. Two things. First, shout out to my partner. Second, I really don't appreciate the use of like foul language. I think it's just a bad debate practice in general, but it's fine. I will start my speech in three, two, one. Closing government is symmetric to the debate. It's unlikely they are meaningfully comparative. The extension says that I guess the US is very uncertain, so they say you need to invest in alternatives without a good enough explanation as to why the alternatives are going to be better for these central banks or it's going to be better for these foreign reserves anyway. At best, they prove why the US is largely suffering. They never explain why the alternative is likely going to be beneficial or why that expansion gives you those impacts anyway. Opening government then is Opening government then is non-exclusive to the debate for two reasons. First, the POI that we ask them is whether or not you can reasonably engage in the global economy without expanding foreign reserves into foreign equity. This is why this is largely important. There are two ways in which people can still largely do this, even in the worst case where you probably lose out on the amount of money on quantity that you're likely to receive from the foreign equity or reduce that investment. The first is because the global economy, and we buy into the chart from opening government, you exist within a globalized economy. Because you exist within a globalized economy, you probably have access to things like foreign trade, bilateral agreements, individuals within these nations who make large contributions and can meaningfully participate. There's a need to explain why then, the way in which central banks then, I guess, get the ability to probably expand their foreign reserves is by well, yeah, is by doing this into like foreign equity and that sort of thing. But secondly, as to why they should do this, we still think internally you're still likely to have high domestic fiscal policy, things like internal productivity. We think it's better for two reasons on comparative. The first, you have a proximity in terms of the kind of things that you handle and that sort of thing. But secondly, it's just better for things like risk absorption, which is the first extension I want to talk about with regards to the absorption of risk. Notice what happens on the comparative. You expand the criteria for volatility. So opening opposition is right and is very brilliant at this to actually explain to you why this is largely hinged on, it's largely pegged to situations where the kind of decisions that that nation makes then affect what's this thing called, the foreign reserves within these foreign equities. So things like geopolitical conflict means that you can actively use these foreign reserves within these foreign equities to do things like retaliate. So it looks like freezing or sanctioning assets. It looks like economic constriction because retaliation is easier, first because reserve is tied to stock. So I guess it's largely easier to do this anyways. But secondly, we think it's more strategic simply because of the analysis on the lack of proximity. You're not close to this thing. It is unlike, it's not within your country. It is more likely to be used by the alternative country in a worse way and that sort of thing. But why is this then largely really, really terrible? Do you think, just chill, we think it becomes like really, really terrible anyways, because first, in terms of how this risk is then likely to be distributed, we think this risk is largely distributed on very asymmetric lines. So first, I guess it's distributed to the common citizen. That's to say, like central banks reasonably engage with the common citizen in terms of like printing of your money, establishing of your exchange rates, etc., etc. But the way in which that happens is people are likely to buy out and probably buy into like alternative investment platforms. So that's very, very terrible. The first, because they are unwilling to largely bear that risk through these central banks. But secondly, they are unwilling to probably have their foreign reserves within this volatile system. Anyways, it is less likely that you meaningfully get any form of utility. Second extension with regards to like institutional integrity, I want to posit that that the engagement of these things is largely speculative on two levels. The first, in terms of like company purchases, but secondly, with regards like ethical incentives and that sort of thing. So it's to say, but to the extent where you make the decision to expand your foreign reserve into foreign equity, is consideration of a lot of things, right? The ethical implications of engaging with like certain countries. It is less likely that you engage with countries that are non-allies, but even secondly, it is less likely that you engage with countries of whose ethics you deem like morally reprehensible and that sort of thing. Please don't unmute and badger. Yeah. So what then? Sorry, disrupted my train of thought. That's ridiculous. Anyways, yeah. Where was I? Hold on. Could you pause my timer? Yeah, please just don't badger my speech for any reason. Please, that would be
You're
great.
currently on 490. You still
Okay,
have
so still, yeah,
you
that's
still
fine.
have 2 minutes and 41 minutes.
That's fine. That's fine. I will resume my speech in three, two, one. Why is this more likely? I think first with regards to optics, so there's a higher incentive to do things that politicize. This is something that's largely public. People are likely going to know about this anyways. But secondly, it's largely dependent on like external markets and that sort of thing. So the trade-off that then happens for a lot of these central banks is having a lot of their economic incentives and economic engagement largely mitigated by these things anyways. The next thing I then want to have a chat about on impact is why it's then more likely that you get a higher level to systemic risk. I think I think there's already an explanation as to how like these equity bonds already work. That's to say, the central bank owns part of your company. You don't have control. There's several criteria, and it's largely influenced by a lot of things in status quo. I think this becomes particularly terrible in specifically within situations where like these economies are largely volatile. That's to say, things like the establishment of how you engage with collateral, for example, it's likely to crash when you most need it, and by extension, then it's more likely that you sell equity at depressed prices. Yeah, and the proportionality of recompensation is then less likely to materialize. It becomes weaker in crisis for two reasons. The first, accessibility is highly symmetric, so So to say higher returns means that the kind of people who then gain it are likely elite, so to say, because they have higher stakes within the central banks anyways. It's likely that the common person becomes the biggest user. On principle, it's just like really, really terrible. On practice, it just becomes asymmetrically harmful. The last thing I then want to have a chat about is with regards then to, what then happens at the point in time where there's a loss of value. Notice, we think the issue in the debate here is, I think, quite simple to say that you have unacceptable financial, political, and democratic risk, right? So at this point of the debate, closing opposition is winning for two reasons. The first is we are able to meaningfully explain to the panel why it is more likely that it's subject to like political constraints that probably harm these foreign reserves within these foreign equities, first on a value level, but second on a protection and preservation level. But secondly, we're just able to explain to you why that economic attachment is largely harmed, because to the extent where you lose value, it means two things specifically. The first is you reduce the amount of credibility that exists within these systems, simply because people are disincentivized from engaging in volatile systems. But secondly, you increase the expectation of inflation, because we agree that equities probably outperform bonds, and that's probably true. The difference then becomes, how do you establish that equity baseline and that sort of thing? We think in the worst case scenario, it's unlikely to be average. On the comparative, you largely like base it along averages. There's minimal, if any, consideration for worst case scenarios. These are very, very terrible for central banks, and for foreign reserves. So proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much, member of opposition, for the fine speech. Now to close the entirety of side government, inviting Gafwood here.
Oh, cool. Can I be heard?
Yep, loud and clear, ready when you are. Just drop me a countdown when you begin.
Cool, I'll do so. I'll just take, like drink some water. Oh, give me like 30 seconds, please. Thank you. Just a disclaimer, I'll be recording my speech, so if someone asks a POI, it may be recorded. I hope that's okay. Oh, POI is like, yeah, preferably through chat. Please don't patch me. I'll just take one after like fifth. Like, I always take one. It's fine. Cool. Let's start on my next board. Doing some housekeeping. First, a clarification. We're the only bench that actually proved to you some likelihood in terms of one, why there is a rise in stock markets, which means that the safety net that you have when like above a safety net is it's better in terms of valuation, etc. That allows you to like lower interest being rates to banks. And then secondly, I'll prove why that trickles down to the average person. Because note that you've heard the word volatile probably 100 times, but when you go through a notes, you will never understand one reason as to why this is volatile. I think then the severe lack of mechanization needs to be addressed from both op benches. But then particularly on like housekeeping again, there are like three reasons why this can trickle down to like let's say like the average person that living in these developing countries. But then secondly also the mechanism that we've explained to you, and I'll just clarify it again, is that one, when currency drops and domestic assets drops in times of crises, the reason that you're able to then probably still have better foreign reserves that give you stability is because exports are now like cheaper for foreign entities, which means that more people can export products to your countries, which means that in comparison they probably have now incentive to earn more in your currency, which means that they are probably now going to like they're probably now going to like invest more into your countries because they just have like the incentive to do so, which means that they benefit by this export, and they benefit because they're able to increase their stock value. When the foreign equity stock value increases, you have stronger foreign reserves. It's simple as that. This is the key link that CG fulfills in this debate, but I'll then explain why this trickle down. Three reasons. One, it protects public spending because you can earn higher long-term returns, and you can strengthen like the state's balance sheet. So it reduces reliance on borrowing or distortionate impose disproportionate taxes, because you can have stable funding for like healthcare, education, and pensions, etc., especially during like crisis. But secondly, it reserves stable the reserves like then stabilize like currency and inflation, because now foreign currency like foreign equities are in like foreign currencies, which means that when your currency is like at a low and there is a like high inflation, etc., their value increases in foreign equities, because they're comparatively on the foreign exchange, they just hold more value in terms of crisis in times of crisis, which means that the reserve gets stronger. Go back to that weighing. But then thirdly, because it reduces crisis frequency and employment shocks, right? It trickles down to then when you diversify the reserves, you can improve the investor confidence that you have. Therefore, you don't take a lot of risk even domestically, but also this like sudden capital flight, etc., and financial crisis is just lesser when it is diversified across multiple investors in foreign players or in foreign countries, right? Which means that there are fewer crises, there are fewer mass layoffs, and you have less like wage compression, etc., which means that ordinary people can access more stable employment. So proud to propose, I think, that on then idea of like OO and CEO, right? Let's just engage with CEO first. I would like to clarify that their engagement is extremely uncharitable, because note that MG never literally says this is only in terms of true for like true in terms of like the US, like in terms of like the US dollar. This is literally true for euro. This is literally true for like gold, etc. Note that gold often like falls, especially in like when like you have more stabler in like incomes, etc., because it is a low return. It becomes a low return asset then, and which means that hoarding in terms of like domestic investors happens in terms of gold and its exchange. All of this means that crisis can happen anytime. I think OG also frames that. But the missing link as to how you solve crisis in a more stable manner during foreign equities is done on like CG. I think then just on responses, first on CO, because they only have one case, and this is not even a case, it's an acquisition, that you are more volatile, right? Three reasons why we're not. One, you diversify shocks instead of concentrating them into domestic assets, which means that domestic assets are literally like guys, please don't do that. Like domestic assets are literally then like exposed to like the same political, economic, and regulatory shocks. This looks like SEBI like increasing like tax slabs, etc., or regulations of profit-making companies in India. But more importantly, like political policies, etc., like reservation, etc., in jobs, which leads to like people like going on strikes, etc. All of this means that you can constantly be repeated into those cycles, especially as a developing country, due to like increased or exposure to like more risks, like in your day-to-day life. But secondly, now foreign equities, what they can do is that they can hedge currency stress rather than amplifying it, which means that when there's a downturn in your domestic assets, you can and when like currencies depreciate, you can now simultaneously like you can like simultaneously stabilize better in like foreign assets. But then thirdly, also because global portfolios don't follow like herd mentality of domestic investors, which means that if India as of now silver is at an all-time high, most domestic investors will invest in silver, and like all of this would like mean that your reserves are then inherently your reserves, guys, 15 seconds gap, your reserves are like inherently then contingent upon this investment from like this herd kind of mentality, because often people don't see this as stable incomes but rather like as profit making incentives, right? Especially for these local investors. All of this means that domestic assets are not likely to be then better than like these foreign equities, because you're diversifying the risks on this comparative in compared to CO, where there is no comparative. Before I go any further, oh sure, go ahead. Three.
Expanding internationally is justified when necessary, but it exists on both ends. The nuance is on how you express your money, not the rate at which you expand. That's why the question is who should facilitate the expansion, the central bank or GICs and other alternatives mentioned earlier.
Thank you. I have 5 reasons why the principle on OO is not currently true for like central banks, right? Like not correctly true for like central banks, right? Why are central banks the most important actor in this debate, and why can GICs not work? First, foreign reserves are like macro stability tools, right? Which means that like they cannot like exist as in investment corporations, which means that when investment corporations have an intention just to maximize the return, they inherently cannot opt for stability, which means you can't achieve that impact on O, right? But secondly, because these are actually credible organizations, they control fiscal policies, etc., and cooperate with governments. I think for GICs, etc., to cooperate with institutions, they need to just cooperate with much more mediators that don't even see them as credible as compared to local banks, like local banks being comparable, being credible, etc., to like central reserve banks. But thirdly, because in when you have a crisis, you need to have like coordination that is interinstitutional. It cannot happen in a more accessible and accelerated manner on OO. But fourthly, you can take equity from central banks without like conservatively like drifting away from investors that are related to these sorry, the banks that are related to these central banks, right? I think then we give you analysis on just how you have more capacity to deal with real world crisis. But secondly, we explain why this is an actual safety net
Time.
just finishing up, through the mechanization on foreign equities being more stable. For all those reasons, vote CG.
All right, thank you very much to the governor for the fine speech. Please do please do ensure that you don't just spam inappropriate remarks within the chat. Do note that we are actually going live streaming right now, so you won't want your content of whatever it is to be broadcasted for the world to see. Inviting now to conclude the entirety of the silent round, opposition whip here.
Hello, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear, ready when you are.
Okay, so I'll be taking my points of information. I don't think I'll take any. I'm very sorry, but maybe after the fourth minute, probably. So yeah, shout out to my partner. Thank you for the good round. This is a final round for the preliminaries. Hopefully we break. Cool. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. During the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, global markets collapsed, banks failed, credit froze, and economies went into deep recession. This crisis was caused by multiple factors. Firstly, in the US, banks gave risky home loans to people who couldn't afford them. Secondly, many banks and investors took risks. But also, thirdly, and most importantly, countries became more interconnected due to things like globalization, that if one problem affected one country, its partners would face the same harm. Important to note, today's markets are again highly volatile, not because of economic factors, but also geopolitical tensions and supply chain issues. Why is this true? Firstly, when you look at different wars that have been existing, for example, the war in Ukraine, it literally led to the disruption of energy and food supply within Europe and globally. But also, secondly, looking at the ongoing US and China trade tensions that have caused uncertainty for global exporters and investors. That alone led to a loss in majority of bank assets that were tied to these sorts of things the side government wants to support within this debate. What was the overall implication of this in this debate? Four things here. Firstly, buying a foreign equity means that the central bank owns part of a company in another country. That means they only profit if the company earns profit within its stock prices. Secondly, central banks don't control these companies. Notice that in most circumstances, decisions by foreign management are literally by those foreign managements, but in most circumstances, your country doesn't have the capacity to then decide with those sorts of markets. Thirdly, foreign equity values change constantly due to like the global supply or like the demand that exists within the vast majority of instances. But also thirdly, we have to note when a central bank buys a foreign equity, the value is affected by the exchange rate between the home country and the foreign countries. What's the overall impact of this within this debate? A foreign government could impose sudden regulations or sanctions affecting that company. With this is that in most circumstances it leads to volatility because you in your home country don't have the safety and the control, that sort of thing. That means that you then lose out within your bank reserves. But also secondly, right, we have to note that in some circumstances prices fall dramatically within short periods of time. This is affecting to you in the vast majority of instances. Note that this engages the entirety of OG's case. OG says monetary stability and long-term economic stability leads to the rise and fall of a country. Note this already takes that out because it shows you how volatility exists and it makes these countries prone to these specific things if they engage with buying those foreign equities. I want to note is that OG says reserve strategies are inefficient, and then like their proof to this is that yields are insufficient to hold people. It then leads to things like inflation. Three things to note here. Firstly, we have to note that low yield assets are unpredictable, with low yield assets actually very predictable. That is to say, a central bank can act in crises without losing its reserves because they can predict the harm that is going to happen to them. But note, when you then buy a foreign equity, if a geopolitical tension then happens, happens, at that point, you can't predict the harm that you then face. That means that you're going to be harmed more in the long run. Secondly, we think that it's counterintuitive, even if we were to have low yields. Why? We think that things like inflation aren't caused by low reserve yields within the vast majority of instances. It is because of things like fiscal policy or monetary supply. We think that it is bad for them to then claim that it is caused by low reserves. And also, thirdly, we have to note that in most circumstances, equities lose value constantly. Why? Because of the different tensions that exist.
Point.
Notice when you look at 2008 and 2009 crisis, they lost value. That meant that the countries that were tied to this literally were affected, which led to more harm. We think that that becomes problematic. The fact that I want to note in this debate is that OG says that they can get shock absorption. We think that this is something that's counterintuitive. Three reasons as to why it happens. Firstly, we think that shock absorption can only work if the asset maintains value during crises. Note, on their side of the house, you can't maintain value during crises. If a sanction happens to your country and you have bought assets within a company in that specific country, you then can't then have that shock absorption. And also, secondly, right, we think that bonds and golds offer more better shock absorption. Why? Because this is liquid and can be sold immediately at that point in time where you face the shock. But also, thirdly, just on who is more affected when the shock happens. Notice that you are affected a lot when the shock happens and most of your assets are in a different country that faces problems. At that point, you then can't then get the benefits that you want to get with the main majority
Point.
of instances. What is CG's case within this debate? CG's main case is that the hegemony of the US dollar and the euro is very uncertain. They say that stock markets are rising in the vast majority of instances, which makes them very beneficial. We think that this is counterintuitive because of three specific things. Firstly, we have to note that foreign reserves aren't just in US dollars or euros. We have to note they're also in gold or other materials. They have to engage at a point where they aren't going to fall. What then happens? Why do they then become worse? But also, secondly, we think that stock markets can rise even in volatile or risky conditions. This is due to things like inflation hedging or optimism that exists in different crises that happen within different countries. This doesn't mean the market becomes safe for you as a country. Why? Notice that even when COVID-19 happened within the COVID recovery, a lot of like the global equity swiped, and many countries thought that they had been helped and whatnot. But notice that there was an instability that literally made a lot of individuals, like a lot of countries, lose their currencies and all that. But also, thirdly, right? The last thing that I want to note within this debate today is that diversification absorbs shock within the vast majority. They imply that diversification absorbs shock within the vast majority of instances, right? But we have to note that even when you look at these equities, they're in these different currencies. That means that they are also prone to being used in the US dollars, and they're also prone to being used by using things like the euros. With this is that it then throws down the whole idea that the hegemony is going to fall, because in the vast majority of instances, even your equities are tied to these US dollars. What then happens at a point where they are also falling when your equities are also falling, right? The last thing that I want to note is that they say that they are able to access some level of stable employment for individuals in the countries. Note that this is something that is counterintuitive because of two specific things. One, we have to note that central banks holding foreign equities doesn't create jobs. Notice that job creation is only and mostly done by different governments. It is not a role for the central bank investment. So not that you don't then trickle down to those things, but even if that's not the point, even if there's a level of profit that is gotten, normally these profits are then put back in the banks. They are put back to things like creating jobs in the vast majority of instances. Why are we better within this debate? See, we show that there is a problem that exists within the society, right? That problem is the geopolitical tensions that could disrupt the stock markets at a point where you then like buy those sorts of equities. Notice that they don't engage this to its entirety. But also, secondly, right, we're able to show you that these trade tensions are highly harmful to these individuals, which could potentially lead to shocks. There's my case.
All right, thank you very much to the opposition whip for the fine speech. This concludes the entirety of this fifth round of Kampala Open 2026, which is a silent round. You may leave the hall after you virtually cross floors and shake hands. And yeah, let's see the verdict later. You know, I wish you all the best for breaking, and later just wait for the result to come. Best of luck.
Thanks for the round, everyone. Cross.
Um, um, Okay, is it possible if we just like go together? You know what? Let's just wait for the rest of them to leave the call, then we can deliver on the result. Wait, is my panelist not here? Where is he? Oh no. Uh, pan did my panelist left? Uh, Reen, are you there?
Do you need breakout rooms to be open?
Sorry?
Do you need like a breakout room to be open for the leads?
First, I actually initially I wanted to ask that, but at the end of the day, I don't even know where is my
Oh, sorry.
panelist right now. I'm not sure whether he dropped off the call. I'm not sure if my panelist dropped off the call during the debate or not because I can't track him. Hold on a second. I do put in the ballot news.